8 bodies, 8 Viking warriors, men who had crossed the North Atlantic in open boats, men who had raided the coasts of England, France, and the Mediterranean, lying face down on a beach in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, arrows in their backs, war clubs beside their skulls, stone-tipped spears driven through iron armor that was supposed to be unbreakable. The year was 1004. The people who killed them were the ones the Vikings called Skraelings, a word of contempt meaning the wretched ones. A people the Norse warriors had assumed would scatter at the first sight of a blade. They did not scatter. Here is the question that no history book has ever answered completely. What happened to the Vikings who were taken alive? Those men, warriors who had survived storms, sea monsters, and the sword edges of half of Europe, disappeared into the forests of North America and were never seen again by their own people. That is what this story is about. Not the Vikings who escaped, the ones who didn't. But to understand what the forest took, we need to understand who walked into it. Around 986 AD, a Norwegian sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown off course between Iceland and Greenland. He sighted an unknown coastline, forested, flat, unlike anything in the Norse world, and sailed away without landing. That decision would haunt Norse history for generations. 15 years later, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, purchased Bjarni's ship and sailed west with 35 men. He reached 3 regions: Helluland, Stone Slab Land, likely Baffin Island; Markland, Forest Land, likely Labrador; and Vinland, Wineland, the northern tip of what we now call Newfoundland, where his men found wild grapes growing along the shore. We know this is not legend. In 1960, Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the physical remains of a Norse settlement at Lonso Meadows. 8 buildings, iron nails, bronze pins, tools that had no business being in the Americas in the year 1000. In 2021, a study published in the journal Nature used dendrochronological analysis to confirm the Vikings were there in exactly the year 1021 AD. Not approximately, not probably, exactly. 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus ever left port. But the settlement was abandoned, suddenly, violently. And the reason begins with a single act of Viking arrogance that set in motion a chain of events no Norse warrior could have predicted. They came to this land believing it would bend to them. The land had other plans. It began with 9 sleeping men, the summer of 104. Thorvald Eriksson, younger brother of Leif, son of Eric the Red, was sailing along the coastline south of the Norse settlement with a small crew. They were not expecting trouble. Weeks on the water without a single sign of conflict. Then they saw something on the beach. 9 dark shapes, clustered together on the sand. They brought the ship closer. 9 men, sleeping beneath 3 upturned skin boats, completely unaware that death was floating toward them across the water. What Thorvald did next reveals everything about how the Vikings understood this land. He attacked. No hesitation. No attempt at contact. No consideration that these 9 men might belong to a larger group, a larger world, a larger consequence. 8 were killed on the spot, cut down with axes and swords before they could reach their weapons. 1 escaped into the trees. The Vikings returned to their ship satisfied. They had no idea they had just signed their own death warrant. That 1 man ran. And within hours, the horizon filled with canoes. Not a handful, not a raiding party, a fleet. Dozens of Skraeling vessels moving fast across the water. Thorvald ordered his men into defensive positions, shields up, weapons ready. But the Skraelings did not come close enough to fight hand to hand. They kept their distance and rained arrows down in coordinated volleys, wave after wave, forcing the Norse warriors to keep their shields raised and their heads down. Most arrows deflected off iron shields. Most. 1 found the gap. A single arrow passed through the narrow space between Thorvald's raised shield and the side of the ship, and drove itself into his armpit. He fell to the deck. He reached up, pulled the arrow free with his own hand, and looked at the blood spreading across his tunic. He already knew. There are moments in history when a man understands, with complete clarity, that the story ends here. Thorvald Eriksson had that moment on the deck of a Norse ship off Newfoundland, in the summer of 1004, holding a Skraeling arrow in his hand, and what he said next has been carried across 1,000 years. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, his final words were, "This is a fine country we have found. There is plenty of fat around my innards. I did not think we would find such abundance, and yet here I am, unable to enjoy it. Bury me here on this headland, put a cross at my head and another at my feet, and call the place Crossness forever after. He was not begging. He was not afraid. He was doing what Norse warriors did in the face of death, naming it, claiming it, refusing to let it be anonymous. But underneath the composure, listen to what he was really saying. This is a fine country. Not, we should not have come. Not, forgive us for what we did this morning. Just, this is a fine country. The words of a man who understood, too late, what he had walked into. Thorvald Eriksson died and was buried by his men on a Newfoundland headland. According to the sagas, he became the first documented European killed by Native Americans, 5 centuries before Columbus. The historical record does not tell us whether his grave has ever been found. It has not. His men sailed back to Greenland with the news, and instead of turning back, instead of accepting that this land was not theirs to take, the Norse world decided to try again. Bigger this time. More people, more weapons, more certainty that this time, the Skraelings would break. They would not break. Around 1010 AD, an Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni organized the most ambitious Norse expedition ever launched toward North America. 160 people, men, women, livestock, cattle, sheep, supplies calculated for a multi-year stay. Karlsefni brought his pregnant wife, Gudrid, Thorbjarnar daughter, because this was not a raiding party. This was not an exploration. This was a civilization attempting to plant itself in foreign soil. They built houses. They found land. For a brief period, it seemed like Vinland might actually work. Then the Skraelings came out of the forest. Not with weapons. Not at first. They emerged carrying furs, beaver pelts, fox skins, the kind of trade goods that made Norse merchants rich back in Greenland. They pointed at the Viking swords. They wanted iron. Karlsefni, mindful of what had happened to Thorvald 6 years earlier, refused to trade weapons. Instead, he sent Gudrid to negotiate. She brought milk, fresh milk from the Norse cattle, something no person on this continent had likely ever tasted. The Skraelings drank it. Every drop. They gave up all their furs in exchange for something they had never encountered and could not name. The Vikings congratulated themselves on their cleverness. They had no idea the transaction had just made them something far more dangerous than enemies. It had made them unpredictable. 3 weeks of silence followed. In war, silence is never peace. It is preparation. When the Skraelings returned, they did not bring furs. They came in numbers that darkened the tree line, carrying weapons, moving with the coordinated purpose of people who had spent 3 weeks deciding how to end this. Karlsefni ordered his men into defensive formation, shields locked, weapons drawn. The Norse shield wall, the same formation that had broken armies across Europe, held its ground. Then the Skraelings raised something into the air that no Viking had ever seen before. The sagas describe it as a long pole with a large dark blue sphere attached, roughly the size of a sheep's stomach, launched through the air with tremendous force. When it struck near the Viking line, it made a sound the sagas struggle to describe. A crack, a roar, something between an explosion and a scream. What exactly this weapon was remains genuinely uncertain. Some historians suggest skin bags filled with burning coals. Others propose compressed animal fat that ignited on impact. No archaeological evidence has yet provided a definitive answer. What the sagas are clear about is the effect. It did not need to kill anyone to win the battle. The sound alone broke the Viking line. Men who had held shields against charging horsemen, against the full force of European armies, ran, not from wounds, not from death, from a sound they could not explain, and a weapon they had never imagined. The retreat became a rout. Norse warriors stumbled over each other toward the ships, throwing away a century of conquest in a single panicked minute. And then, from the middle of the chaos, one person stopped running. Her name was Freydis Eiriksdottir, illegitimate daughter of Eric the Red, half-sister to Leif and Thorvald. 8 months pregnant, she could not run fast enough to reach the ships, but she was not going to die running. According to the saga of Eric the Red, she called out to the retreating men, "Why do you run from these people? Men like you should be able to slaughter them like cattle." No one stopped, so Freydis stopped herself. She found the body of a fallen Viking and pulled the sword from his hand. She turned to face the advancing Skraelings. And then she did something that has puzzled historians, anthropologists, and storytellers for 1,000 years. She tore open her tunic, exposed her breast, and began striking it with the flat of the sword, again and again, howling. The Skraelings stopped. An army of warriors, men who had just broken the most feared fighting force in the medieval world, stopped, stared, and then, according to both major sagas recording this event, turned and retreated. No one has ever fully explained why. Perhaps it was the sheer incomprehensibility of what they were seeing. Perhaps there was a cultural meaning in the gesture that has been lost entirely. Perhaps it was simply the spectacle of a heavily pregnant woman who was more frightening than they were. What we know is this. Freydis Eriksdotter, 8 months pregnant, alone, holding a dead man's sword, bought enough time for the surviving Vikings to reach their ships. Karlsefni's colony held on for 3 years. Then the unrelenting pressure of Skraeling resistance broke what Freydis had temporarily saved. He returned to Greenland. His son Snorri, born in Vinland, the first known European born in the Americas, made the crossing home as a small child, carrying with him the only lasting proof that the Norse had ever tried. The colony was finished, but the real question was only just beginning. What happened to the Vikings who never made it back to the ships? There are no Viking graves at Lonso Meadows, not one. Archaeologists have excavated that site for decades. They found iron nails, bronze pins, spindle whorls, the physical remnants of 8 buildings, the ash of Norse hearths. They found evidence of lives lived and evidence of departure made in haste. Objects left behind that no careful settlement would abandon. Fire pits extinguished too quickly. A silence in the archaeological record that speaks louder than anything the sagas recorded. But no graves. In any settlement of meaningful size, people die. From illness, from injury, from the ordinary cruelty of a harsh winter in an unfamiliar land. In a Norse community, the dead are buried with ritual, with markers, with the kind of care that says, this person existed, this person mattered, this person deserves to be found. No one at Lonso Meadows was buried that way, which means either the dead were given to the sea, a practice some Norse communities followed, or some of them did not die in ways that allowed their comrades to bury them at all. Some of them, the evidence suggests, were taken. And what the forest did with them is the question that has haunted this story for 1,000 years. The people the Vikings most likely encountered were the Beothuk, the indigenous people of Newfoundland who had lived on that island for centuries before the first Norse ship appeared. Scholars consider the Beothuk the most probable group based on geographic overlap, though direct confirmation remains beyond what the current evidence can establish. The Beothuk are extinct today. The last of them, a woman named Shanaudithid, died in 1829, not from Viking arrows, but from tuberculosis brought by English colonizers centuries later. Their oral traditions are largely lost with them, but what survives, through accounts of neighboring tribes, through early European contact records, through the work of anthropologists, gives us a framework for understanding what may have happened to Norse warriors who fell into their hands. It is not a comfortable framework. The first possibility, consistent with what anthropologists understand of northeastern woodland warfare, is ritual execution. Male warriors captured in battle were not simply killed, they were brought back to the village, tied to a post in a public space, and then, over hours or sometimes days, subjected to ritualized torment designed to serve a specific cultural purpose, not cruelty for its own sake, but a ceremony in which the captive was expected to participate. The captive was supposed to sing, not beg, not scream. Sing, to chant his war deeds, to mock his captors, to prove through his endurance that he was worth capturing in the first place. For a Norse warrior, trained from childhood to die with a weapon in his hand, this death, slow, public, weaponless, would have been a specific kind of horror beyond physical pain. In Norse belief, a warrior who died with honor in battle was received into Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where the heroic dead feasted until the end of the world. But a warrior who died bound to a post, unable to raise a weapon, in a ceremony he did not understand, that warrior had no clear path home. The Skraelings, perhaps without knowing it, had found the one death that could break a Viking not just in body but in soul. The second possibility is adoption. This was documented among northeastern woodland peoples. Captives, particularly younger men, or those who demonstrated adaptability, were sometimes fully integrated into the tribe, given a name, given a family, expected to become, over time, genuinely one of the people. It is possible, and this is speculation grounded in established anthropological patterns, not confirmed history, that somewhere in the forests of Newfoundland, a Norse warrior learned to build a birch bark canoe, learned to track caribou through snow, learned to speak a language with no word for Valhalla, no concept of Odin, no memory of the sea he had crossed to get here, lived out his days as someone else entirely. Whether that is tragedy or survival depends entirely on how you measure a life. The third possibility is slavery. The Norse had a word for it, thrall. In Viking society, thralls were the lowest of the low, captured in raids, forced into labor, treated as property. It was a fate Norse warriors spent their entire lives trying to avoid. The bitter irony is that some of those warriors may have ended their lives as exactly that, thralls. Not to a European lord, not to a rival Norse chieftain, but to the people they had called the wretched ones. History has a particular talent for this kind of symmetry. The fourth possibility is supported by the most intriguing physical evidence. Norse artifacts, iron nails, fragments of woven wool, and what researchers have identified as a possible fragment of a Norse copper alloy have been recovered at indigenous sites on Baffin Island, far north of Newfoundland. These objects did not walk there. They moved through indigenous exchange networks stretching thousands of kilometers across the Arctic. It is worth being careful here. The presence of Norse objects at these sites does not confirm the presence of Norse people. Objects travel in ways that people do not always follow, but the pattern is suggestive, and some researchers have raised the possibility, presented carefully as hypothesis rather than conclusion, that Norse individuals themselves may have moved through these networks, that a man captured on a Newfoundland beach might have passed from one group to another, northward deeper into a continent that had no name for him, until he found himself among Inuit families in the high Arctic, thousands of kilometers from the ocean he had crossed. No saga would have recorded his name. No Norse ship would have come looking. No one would have known where to start. Every one of these scenarios ends the same way. A Norse warrior, a man raised on stories of Odin and Valhalla and the glory of dying well, ending his days far from the sea, far from his gods, far from anyone who would remember his name and the language he was born speaking. That is not a defeat recorded in any saga, but it is perhaps the most complete defeat of all. The deeper question is not what happened to them, it is why. And to answer that, we have to understand exactly where the Vikings went wrong. The Vikings were not weak. That needs to be said clearly, because the temptation when studying this story is to diminish them, to explain their defeat by making them smaller than they were. The Norse warriors who came to Vinland were the same people who had terrorized the coastlines of Europe for 2 centuries. They had sacked Paris. They had founded Dublin. They had established trade routes from Scandinavia to Constantinople. They had crossed the North Atlantic in open wooden boats, using nothing but stars and instinct. They were not weak. They were wrong. Wrong in 5 specific ways that compounded each other until there was no path left but retreat. First, numbers. Karlsefni's expedition of around 160 people faced indigenous populations numbering in the thousands across Newfoundland and Labrador. The Vikings could win individual skirmishes. They could not win a war of attrition against a force that could absorb losses indefinitely, while every Norse casualty was irreplaceable. Second, supply lines. Every broken sword, every spent arrow, every warrior who fell represented a deficit that could only be filled by a ship from Greenland, weeks away across open ocean. The Skraelings fought on home ground, supplied by the land itself. The Vikings fought as guests who had worn out their welcome and could not call for reinforcements. Third, tactics. The Norse shield wall was one of the most effective military formations in the medieval world, against enemies who agreed to stand in front of it. The Skraelings did not agree. They attacked from tree lines. They used psychological weapons the Vikings had no framework to counter. Every military advantage the Norse possessed assumed a battlefield that the Skraelings simply refused to provide. Fourth, technology. Iron against stone sounds decisive, until you remember that an arrow shot from distance does not care what your shield is made of. The gap in weaponry was real. It was not wide enough to matter. Fifth, psychology. The Vikings had come to Vinland carrying a story about themselves. That story said they were the most feared warriors in the world, that inferior peoples scattered before them, that conquest was their natural inheritance. Vinland did not confirm that story. Vinland dismantled it, battle by battle, arrow by arrow, until the men who had crossed an ocean looking for glory were running for their ships from a sound they could not explain. You can recover from physical defeat. You can regroup, resupply, return. What you cannot easily recover from is the discovery that the story you built your identity around was never true. The Vikings didn't lose because they were weak. They lost because they were wrong. Wrong about the land, wrong about the people, and wrong about what conquest actually costs. After Karlsefni's colony collapsed, the sagas record one final Norse attempt to maintain a presence in Vinland. According to those accounts, it ended in internal violence as much as external conflict, the settlement fracturing from within before external pressure finished it from without. And then, silence. Within a generation, direct memory of Vinland faded from the Norse world. The sagas preserved fragments. The ruins at Lonso Meadows preserved stones. But the living knowledge, the navigational routes, the seasonal patterns of the coast, the names the Norse had given to bays and headlands, all of it dissolved. For roughly 500 years after the last Viking ship left Vinland, North America remained in the hands of its original peoples. The Beothuk held Newfoundland. The Algonquian nations held the eastern woodlands. The great civilizations of the continent continued their histories without a European footprint on their soil. 500 years. Then the ships came back, this time with diseases that moved faster than any army, with firearms that made the technology gap decisive, with numbers that no indigenous resistance could ultimately absorb. The people who had driven out the Vikings, who had held their island against the most feared warriors in medieval Europe, were gone by 1829, not defeated in battle, erased. The last of them died not from a wound but from tuberculosis in a colonial settlement. Far from the forests her ancestors had defended for 1,000 years. She was named Shanawadithit. She was approximately 23 years old. The people who defeated the Vikings did not lose to the Vikings. They lost to what came after, and what came after had learned nothing from what happened before. Somewhere in the forests of Newfoundland, in soil that has never been excavated, in ground that has no marker and no name, there may be bones, Norse bones, the remains of warriors who crossed an ocean and did not cross back, men who died in ways the sagas could not record, because no one who witnessed them survived to tell it, men whose names were spoken for the last time by people who did not share their language, in a world that had already decided to forget them. History does not remember the Vikings who stayed, it only remembers the ones who ran. That, perhaps, is the cruelest defeat of all. The next time someone tells you the Vikings were the greatest warriors the world has ever seen, remember Vinland. Remember Thorvald Eriksson, pulling an arrow from his own side on the deck of a ship off Newfoundland, spending his last breath naming a headland no one would remember. Remember Freydis 8 months pregnant, alone, holding a dead man's sword, doing what an entire army of Norse warriors could not. Remember the men who never came home, who the forest took and never gave back. And remember the Beothuk, the people who won the battle and lost everything else, whose last member died in 1829 with the name of her nation on her lips and no one left to hear it. This is what conquest costs. Not just the ones who lose, everyone.